Okay, why don't we get started? It's 5 after, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wilton Library. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. Because we have a large audience, we'll handle the Q&A as follows. You can send me your questions using the Q&A button, and I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. And by the way, Mark is always happy to answer questions that you can email him later, and I know that several of you have been doing that as we've had him in the past number of months and years. I'm going to skip his intro because I think almost everybody heard it last week, and we're getting a little bit of a late start, so let's turn this over then to Mark.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Michael. Sorry for the delay. Last time I had to leave at the stroke or just before the first hour. That won't be true again. It won't be true today, so I'm not on that kind of clock. So today we turn to Howard's End, E.M. Forster. He published 5 novels in his lifetime. His 2 masterpieces are considered this one, published in 1910 when he was 45, and then Passage to India 14 years later. That was 1924. And then he stopped publishing fiction, and he lived on a good long time, another 46 years to the age of 91 in 1970. And I say this because even though he wasn't publishing fiction from 1924 until his death in 1970, and then a posthumous novel was published which had homosexual themes. He was a homosexual, as was known to his friends, but not to his readers. And for those nearly 50 years, he was heralded as the greatest living British novelist, even though he hadn't produced a novel since Passage to India. I mentioned last time that one aspect of the modern British novel and modern British literary culture is the idea of connecting to the small society, not grand national ideas, not isms, but other people, that our salvation is in other people. And I mentioned last time that the epigraph to this novel is only connect. In the text of the novel, it talks about connecting the prose and the passion, but connection is at the heart of the novel. And what Forster is doing is he's looking at what was called at the end of the 19th century, the condition of England question. That is, if democracy, or English-style democracy, was becoming more and more the order of the day, if more and more white men could have the vote, even though they didn't own property, what would become of England if it was going to be turned over to people without breeding, without property, without class? And the final nail in the coffin in that question occurred right after this novel was published in 1910, but was in the air for decades. The Parliament Act of 1911 made formal the dominance of the House of Commons over the House of Lords. That was the ascendancy of the upper middle class. And for people like the Wilcoxes, who have a home like Howard's End, for people who live in Downton Abbey, it was a very serious question. What are we to do with the idea that the people of quality are no longer in control? And so in his own way, Forster is confronting a serious problem for the age. He uses the phrase panic and emptiness. There was a genuine concern among intellectuals, some artists, but mainly politicians and upper middle class and aristocrats, that England was going to go to the dogs because it was no longer a matter of people of breeding. And one way to see this novel is that in addition to connecting the poetry and the prose, if the gene pool, as it was, of the 2 strains of major characters, the Schlegels, who are intellectuals and love art, but are not involved in the world of moving and shaking. They're not involved in the world of doing, of politics. And the Wilcoxes and Schlegel, of course, take their name from the German idealist philosopher. So like Beethoven, a German represents the height of culture, music, literature. Those two sisters and their brother are modeled on Virginia Woolf and her sister and brother. And the Wilcoxes, who by their name are people of will and cocksure, they're unthinking, but they're plutocrats. They're the people who have the money, who have their hands on the ropes. They may move in a world of telegrams and anger, but they get things done. And what Foster recognized, and what he has Margaret recognize in the story, is that the intellectualism, the aestheticism, the love of imagination and personal connection that's represented by the Schlegels is no good if it can't be translated into action. And that the world of power and momentum and getting things done, the sort of thing that gets bridges built, that's represented by the Wilcoxes, is completely useless if it doesn't have the sensibility of art and imagination, especially imagination, in the sense not only of imagining a picture, a novel, a play, a symphony that didn't exist before, but imagining the central issue for Foster. What is it like to be somebody else? What's it like for Margaret to have an understanding of Mr. Wilcox that nobody else in the novel has? What's it like for Margaret to meet the first Mrs. Wilcox and have a connection to her and understand her better than her own children do? What would it be like if people could connect over class differences? And so he constructs what might seem a schematic novel, if you're going to explain it as I will now, that you have Henry having a mistress, Jackie, who's involved with Leonard Bast, who is the third strain, the lower middle class, uncultured person trying to get ahead. His name suggests that he doesn't have any genetic or familial provenance. He's a kind of a bastard. So Henry connects with Jackie, and Henry's son Paul connects with Helen. So there's a Wilcox-Schlegel connection of a kind. But then, of course, Henry famously connects not through sexual congress, as they would say, but by marriage with Margaret, a woman, we're told, of profound vivacity. Helen gets her name from Helen of Troy. Margaret gets her name from the female heroine of Faust. Literature is everywhere in E.M. Foster's frame of reference. It's worth noting that Leonard is killed by a falling bookcase. So the Wilcoxes have energy, but no taste, no imagination, no sympathy, no understanding of other people. The crime they're guilty of is having a personal request made to them by their mother and turning it down. And again, Foster makes the point that it was a personal appeal, and they said no. And so in the schema of things, if you can have the Wilcoxes and the Schlegels intermixed through marriage, and you can have a child that is the child of Helen and Leonard, Schlegel and the lower middle class, might England be better off symbolically when that child at the last scene of the novel is enjoying being out in the hay and not being affected by hay fever the way the Tippy was. And the last line of the novel, or the last paragraph, the field's cut, Helen cried excitedly, the big meadow, we've seen to the very end, and it'll be such a crop of hay as never. That may seem paltry, but it's meant to be emblematic of what you do in a world where the ancestral legacy of Howard's End is not going to carry its own momentum without an influx of new spirit. And the new spirit doesn't have to be dramatic, but it does have to be emotional and artistic and imaginative. So in the context of this, again, when Henry is obtuse about his wife and the legacy, Margaret says to him in chapter 22, after she has accepted his proposal of marriage 2 chapters earlier, that it's better to be broad in one's attention to an experience of life, have a breadth of connection, a breadth of understanding, to be open. His reply is, my motto is concentrate, capital C. His motto is concentrate. And that's the tension in the novel. You need an element of concentration, of focus to get things done, but you also need a breadth of understanding to recognize what the right things are to be done. Matthew Arnold, some 40 years before this novel, wrote in a series of essays that I've referenced in our Victorian series called Culture and Anarchy, by which he meant culture or anarchy, that if in the place of aristocrats running the country, you allowed the common man, and we're still talking about not most men and still of a certain social stature, but middle-class men. If you allow them to do what they want, Arnold said, who's going to teach them what they should want? That was a very serious question. If they don't have the advantage of being raised in a Downton Abbey or a Howard's End, if they don't know the kind of taste that comes with being gentrified, how do we know they'll pick the right thing? How do we know that they'll make the right choices? For Arnold, it was education. For Arnold, it was culture that would stave off anarchy. But for E.M. Foster, some 40 years later, a modern world soon to enter the First World War, it's a much more complicated question. And he proposes a connection between strains of families that is meant to be emblematic of something much larger. 14 years later, when he turns his attention to the world, he's suggesting that a connection between the East and the West, between England and India, between the imperialist and the colony, between empiricism and a kind of rich spirituality is actually the solution, writing between the wars. But in that novel, it's decided that the connection cannot be made at that time, that it's not possible. The relatively easy solution of uniting these families in the hopes that some combination of breadth and concentration, some combination of the rural aristocracy and the urban aesthetic person, of power and imagination, will save the country. He's quite serious about that, that could save the country. In the same way, Virginia Woolf earnestly believed that her novels that redefined what it is to be a character in a novel, redefined what consciousness is in a novel, and tried to encourage people to redefine what they thought of as their own character and their own consciousness. She believed that her work would actually prevent a Second World War. It didn't, and the onset of her mental illness coincided with the start of the next World War, and the combination of it broke her and she committed suicide. But until then, Woolf, like Foster, believed that the novel could help change the world. E.M. Foster, like Virginia Woolf, is a novelist of ideas. And most of Victorian novels that we spoke about in the last series, especially Dickens as a prime example, are not novelists of ideas. They're novelists of experiences, novelists of suffering, of the hardships of life, of a kind of success, lots of emotion. You don't read Dickens for his ideas any more than you read Shakespeare for his ideas. You read it for how well they capture experience. But these modern British novelists felt that the world was in such dire straits that they had to write novels about ideas. So he is much more optimistic than his fellow writers. He and Woolf, as I mentioned last time. The darker novelists are more pessimistic. We're going to read first. That is Conrad, not only the novel we did last time, The Secret Agent, but his earlier novella, Heart of Darkness, the horror, even worse than Panic and Emptiness. And the other more pessimistic of the quartet is the last writer we're doing, Graham Greene, where Brighton Rock is an exceedingly grim novel. Don't hold your breath waiting for the musical to be made of Brighton Rock, a very, very dark novel, as you'll see. But in between, we have these more optimistic ones. And part of what carries the message of Howard's End is you'll remember that The Secret Agent is a dark novel. I think it's a dark novel to read. Petty people, lots of negative adjectives and adverbs. You have the sense that it's being told by no one in particular, but we're moving in a claustrophobic world where everyone's networked to somebody else. Everyone's working at cross purposes and secret agency. The final image of the professor seeking the perfect detonator is out like a pest in the world of men. This image of kind of pandemic or infection. That's Heart of Darkness, that's Secret Agent. You'll see some of that same claustrophobic darkness in Brighton Rock. Here, by contrast, the world, the climate is completely different. This novel has a lot more sunshine, and I mean sunshine in the sense that you feel it's being narrated by someone who's in a world of sunlight and at least good intentions. And the opening of the novel begins, one may as well begin with Helen's letters to her sister. So I hope that struck you as odd. It is a very odd way to open a novel. That is not to open with a letter, Meg to Helen, and then Helen replying. That's conventional enough. Pride and Prejudice was originally to be an exchange of letters. And we know that the 18th century novel began in epistolary form. That is, there was no narrator. They were just people writing to each other. And the novel began when the most common writing task that literate people had, writing letters to their intimates, got conceived as a way to incorporate the view of not only the social world, but the psychological realism of people who now were considered interesting enough to carry a work of art, even if they weren't a prince or princess or hero, the way they would have to be before the novel decided that the middle class average person, whether it's Moll Flanders or Tom Jones, was worthy of a work of art. It's not that it begins with letters between sisters, it's that it begins with the line, one may as well begin with Helen's letters to her sister. So if this were a class, if you were adult students in my class in literature, I would ask you to give a sense of what you made of that, but I'll answer my own question by saying someone who can write that is a self-conscious storyteller. So he knows he's writing a novel, or at least telling a story. He also knows when he says one may as well begin with Helen's letters, that he also knows what the story is before it starts. So when you read something like the self-narration of Jane Eyre or Holden Caulfield or Nick Carraway, even though we realize they're aware they're telling a story, they don't typically convey at the beginning of the story that they know how it will end. You get the sense, certainly with Holden Caulfield, that he is experiencing it as he's telling you. David Copperfield tells you that whether he winds up being the hero of his life or not, you have to wait until the ending. Well, he knows, but he's also a novelist. David Copperfield is, and so is Dickens. This person who's telling this, beginning the story, knows how the story ends. and has made an artistic decision that the way to let us have entree into the world of this novel is through the letters. And so that self-assuredness, that emphasis from the very beginning on the first person speaker, you write your own letter, you speak in your own voice. The intimacy between these two sisters, who, as different as they are sisters in a bond that won't be broken. All of that is signaled in the beginning of the novel of people of value, even though they're not landed gentry. And many people in the day reading in 1910 would have been struck by that it's a novel that is a very different tone from the opening of, say, Pride and Prejudice, It's a Truth, University of Knowledge, or Anna Karenina, All Happy Families Are Alike, Each Unhappy Family is Unhappy in Its Own Way. Even though those are both large claims about the way the world works, they don't suggest that the narrator is aware of how the story will turn out. This narrator does. And so you're prepared, whether you realize it consciously or not, for a story that's going to have a beginning, middle, and an end. Remember that Secret Agent switches around the time frame, has a kind of confusing time frame. Joyce is famous for playing with time. Both Mrs. Dalloway and Ulysses are novels that take place in a single day, very unusual for a novel. This is a novel with a beginning, middle, and end in that order. And we're being told by someone who is in control of his material, he's not going to lecture us, but he's going to instruct us. And I say he's not going to lecture us because I think one thing most people find, and I'd be happy to hear this from you, is that he's a very good storyteller, a good mix of showing and telling, of dialogue and description. I can't be the only person who's had the experience that when you read The Secret Agent, especially if you read it in one sitting or many hours at a time, you feel like you need to open a window, that so many people in it are unattractive morally, and even people with good intentions try to carry them out by ignoble means. This is a very different novel. Bad things happen, bad people are in it, but the medium in which it's being presented is the medium of civilized society, very British. I'm going to stop there since we're at the first half hour and try to make up for some of my not being able to take a lot of questions or many questions last time. And my hope that with each successive installment, you all are in a better position to make comments or ask questions. And I'm going to stop at the halfway point and ask Michael if he has any questions especially, or comments for me.
Okay, well, thanks, Mark. I think so far, there aren't any questions in the Q&A box, but that may be people thinking they were going to wait longer to put them in. So we can let people have a chance to put that in. One thing that occurs to me from what you talked about last week and what you just talked about at the beginning here is you are mentioning many kinds of dichotomies, and that's a great way of looking at a lot of things, especially novels of ideas, as you said. But you might think that the most important dichotomy of them all, with the books you selected, is the dichotomy of pre and post World War I. But yet, the dichotomies you've been mentioning span across that. You've got a dark novel and an optimistic novel from both before and after the war. So my long prelude here is to say, how important was World War I as the prime dividing point in the evolution of these modern novels over the 4 decades?
Yeah, well, it depends on when you're talking about, and also it depends on who you're reading. So there were people who, even after the war, believed it was the war to end all wars. And if you were writing in English because you were a Brit, you were celebrating the fact that England won and beat back the Hun. But if you were someone who had an experience of the suffering of the war, especially the trauma caused by survivors, victims of the war, the gas, the no man's land, the trauma. You will see this in Septimus Smith next time. You saw it not as a war to end a war, but a kind of, again, Curtian horror. It depends on who you're talking to. It's certainly true that World War I effectively ended the myth of the 19th century. Remember, that war was waged because of treaties and agreements made between desiccated European families. And young men died, young Englishmen died on the fields of France to honor decades-old treaties that if your Archduke gets assassinated, we will join in this war. But it didn't happen as soon as the war was over that people were able to look at it with any sense of distance. So it took until the 1920s for people who were willing to write about it to start looking back, whether it's Hemingway in Farewell to Arms or Eric Maria Remarque in All Quiet on the Western Front, or Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, which again is a kind of closet war novel, to look back and say something terrible happened in the war, something bigger than victory and defeat. And that becomes an overarching theme in a lot of literary works that seem to have nothing to do with the war. It does infect Mrs. Dalloway in the person of Septimus Smith, a woman who's trying to hold a kind of posh party, finds herself unnerved to learn that a man she's never met committed suicide. It infects The Great Gatsby in the sense of desolation, as I mentioned, the ashes in front of the big billboard advertisement of Dr. Ecclesburg. It informs the sense of disconnectedness that Ulysses is trying to address, set in 1904, but published in 1922. And it is absolutely the historical center of T.S. Eliot's great poem, The Wasteland, which has other forebears in literature and philosophy and mythology and anthropology, but is first and foremost a reminder in 1922 that the wasteland of modern civilization is the war. What Foster is doing in 1910 is he's holding out a hope that good relations between radically different people can salvage not just society, but the future of England. And again, that might seem naive, but these writers had a kind of idealism. I've said this before when we talked about Ulysses. I may say it again before this series is over. James Joyce actually believed that if he wrote novels and short stories, especially Dubliners, that showed the Irish reading public how parochial, how narrow-minded, how stagnated, how locked in religion and politics and fear of sexuality, how they had no breath of the kind that Foster's arguing for. He actually believed that if he showed them, look what's wrong with you, they would say, thank you, Jimmy, we're going to try to do better. He really did think that by leaving Ireland and writing about nothing but Ireland, they would say, you know what, you're right, you got it right. He lamented that Dublin was a European capital that was not seen as a great city. And he felt that Dublin had all the possibilities of being a city to rival London and Paris if it wasn't for, and I'm making a joke that he made, all the Dubliners who are in it. That is, these people who are cowed by whether they're wearing the right color, who are locked in using a language, English, that is not the language of their ancestry, who are besotted by alcoholism and a narrow sense of what religion and spirituality can do. He was preaching for breadth, the kind of expansiveness that Margaret's talking about, in this novel that E.M. Foster is talking about. Lawrence was preaching a kind of expansiveness by saying the body can save you. It's not the enemy. And these writers were dead serious that their writing could improve society. Virginia Woolf was more delicate. She thought that it would be the kind of thing that if people became habituated to writing novels in which sensitivity and a kind of mental, psychological, sympathetic understanding of other people. In her last novels, it almost borders on telepathy, that kind of understanding can actually civilize the savage traits of human beings and prevent another war. That mission is very much a part of modernism in these writers. Not so much Graham Greene and Conrad, who have a darker view, although Conrad does believe that solidarity between human beings, that connection again, that only connect, can be a salvation.
Great, thanks, Mark. That was a great presentation. So Patricia is asking, please comment on Henry's question toward the end of the novel, did I do wrong? When Margaret asks him about Mrs. Wilcox leaving Howard's End to her.
Yeah. So who asked that question? Who submitted that question just now?
Patricia.
Patricia, I
Brady.
want to make an invitation to you that if the answer I give you now is not satisfying, I'm going to do my best. You follow up with an email to me later because I want to do this justice. I think the most important thing about that question, and I assume when you say comment, you mean say what I want, is not whether he's right or wrong, but that he has decided to ask Margaret that question. So when he asked that question, he's lost some of his concentrated self-assurance, and he's turned himself over to her judgment. Whatever she says, whatever he feels about what she says, whatever you, Patricia, think the right answer should be, what's most significant is he's bothered to ask her. I think you can be reasonably sure he's not in the habit of asking people, did I do right? Did I do well? Now, it's also partly true that like Rochester in Jane Eyre, he's partly a broken man. He's not the man he was. Bad things have happened to his family. But he's still enough in control of himself that he could avoid that question if he wanted to, but he asked it. And I think there's a suggestion there that he might be a better person than, say, Helen thinks he is. It's also true that we're told in the novel that he's a much better man than his son. And I don't know how many of you in reading got the sense that what seemed improbable when it happened was actually being foreshadowed. But there are hints that Margaret and Henry get each other in a way that many of the other characters do not. In their own ways, they're each more attentive to other people than some of their bloodline. Again, Patricia, if that doesn't satisfy you, I'm happy with it, but if not, please accept my invitation to follow up by email.
Great, thanks, Mark. Okay, in both your Victorian novel series and in Howard's End, I'm interested in the role of women as self-actualizing individuals, as opposed to in Conrad, which I thought would be more typical. Can you comment on which perspective on women is more typical, quote unquote, of Victorian and modern British novels?
Yeah, that's an enormous question that even if I knew the answer, I couldn't possibly give justice to in a short reply. You're asking about women in both the Victorian and the modern British novel, which are multivarious novels. And also I've covered Victorian at another series, so I'm going to allow myself to just talk about the modern British, which is what this series is about. Part of it depends upon the attitude of the author, of course, to women and their relation in society. So Virginia Woolf, of course, is a woman. E.M. Foster was a homosexual, which doesn't automatically, I want to make this clear, make him more sympathetic to women. But as in his case, as someone who loved men as sexual partners, who recognized that he could not come out in British society. Again, he kept that a secret from his public his entire long 90 years. He probably was much more sensitive to the feminine in society. I want to make it clear, I'm not making the gross stereotype that just because you're a gay male, you're more sympathetic to feminist issues. There are many gay men, I know some of them, who aren't particularly sympathetic to women or feminism, but I think he is one who would be. Graham Greene is fascinated by Catholicism and the notion of sin. And to be fascinated by Catholicism and the notion of sin is not a good introduction to being fair-minded to women. It's not a good way to get at understanding women. And so I think he comes, as great a writer as he is, with a certain kind of disadvantage. Conrad got into novel writing by writing adventure stories. First, typical South Sea romances, where most of what happens is external to people and has some psychology, but not real psychological depth, and then grew into his talent by writing about the interior lives, almost always of men. So a woman matters as a kind of prop in Heart of Darkness. And there are women, not just Winnie and her mother, but the patroness who helps one of the terrorists. There are men in that novel who feed off women, but the women themselves are not movers and shakers, because that's a novel where nothing gets moved and things only get shaken, but not improved. Mrs. Verloc turns out to actually cause indirectly the death of her son. Winnie is completely obtuse to what's going to happen if she puts her son more and more in the presence of her husband, who she should know is a blob, which is how he's described more than once, pure animal appetite. And in fact, when she is upset with him and says his name before she stabs him, he misunderstands it to be an invitation to lovemaking rather than disgust at his physicality. So Conrad and Greene and the novels that we're doing, I'm not sure share the notion of what's possible with women, the way that Foster and Graham Greene, Foster and Woolf, especially D.H. Lawrence. I mean, The Rainbow and Women in Love are probably the two best novels to illustrate what the modern British novel can do with a newfound sensitivity to women. And James Joyce, I would say, is a mixed bag. I think his interests are largely with male characters, but you cannot read Penelope, the concluding chapter of Ulysses, and not think that this writer has extraordinary insight into the world of that single but multivaried, remarkable woman. So I think it's a mixed answer. I think it's a mixed time. It's certainly true that English society was puzzled by the arrival of the new woman, late 19th century idea that women could take their place in society. But the model on the English throne was not a new woman, Victoria, but an old woman. That is a kind of bourgeois matriarch, married, dowdy in the sense that she didn't have the kind of elegance that some people think of now as a model for innovation. They respected her, they loved her, but there was a dissonance between the idea of what Victoria represented and what women could be capable of in a new society. That's a very broad answer because it's a broad question. I'd be curious to know, Michael, if anyone will put it in the question and answer. Did people enjoy reading this novel in a different way from the way they enjoyed or experienced The Secret Agent? Does this novel seem more accessible and contemporary? Does it seem old-fashioned to read this novel that's well over 100 years old? Those are questions that interest me.
Okay, folks. Well, why don't you just use the Q&A button, as some people have already done, to give us questions, and just let's hear what you think about your experience of reading this. And Mark, maybe while we give people a few minutes to do that, we can take a small side trip into a genre that I know you're interested in, which is film, and maybe you could just make a comment about either the film itself, which was such a great hit and very well regarded, or
Yeah.
even just the relationship of the film to the book.
Yeah. So I want to say I enjoyed the film very much when I saw it. It's decades since I saw it, so I can't talk about it in any granular way. But I will say that the production value and the casting of the people they put in it conveys exactly what I meant by the tone of E.M. Forster writing a novel that's meant to be upper middle class, urbane, sophisticated. You get the sense that even though the narrator talks about the goblins coming in Beethoven's symphony, and the panic and emptiness and the fact that the world is threatened, that he himself is not going to get a stomach upset or a headache about this, that there's something very composed about this narrator. And that sense of authorial composure is very much in the movie in terms of its direction and production values. Very, merchant ivory kind of assuredness that I think absolutely reflects the sensibility of the novel. One of the things that undergraduates have to learn, and I hope they learn it when I used to teach English full time, is that it's not just what a novel is about. It's not just the plot of the novel. It's the way the narrator pitches the plot of the novel. So there's a death in this novel. There's a death in A Secret Agent. The attitude of the narration to Stevie being blown to bits, and not just that that's a more horrific death, is worlds removed from the composure of the death in the library in this novel. And that's all conveyed by the medium. And because students have learned or have failed to learn that the medium is something they should pay attention to, they're interested in symbolism, because that's a good thing to write a paper on. I don't say this in a dismissive way. That's a good thing to write a paper on. And they also know irony, and they know foreshadowing. And sometimes getting a sense of the plot is a real accomplishment. It's not a trivial thing to remember why one thing leads to another. But if they're less attentive to narration, they're not going to miss a lot of the novel. So the pitch of Mrs. Dalloway is even more rarefied, even more immediate in sense of conveying Clarissa, even though she's not telling her novel. It talks about Clarissa, but Clarissa is speaking through that narration.
Okay, thanks. Well, believe it or not, we don't have any reactions to your provocative question, Mark. Oh, wait, hang on.
I believe
Hang on,
anything.
I got one.
Oh,
I
okay.
got another one.
All right.
It is interesting to read the novel knowing that the Woolf siblings were an inspiration.
Okay. Well, then I'm glad I mentioned it. I want to say that I am glad I mentioned it. He saw them as an emblem of what that kind of interest in art, and I can't say this enough, even though I've probably said it too often for some of you. When I talk about people like the Schlegels being interested in art, I don't mean that in the dilettantist sense that they want to collect things or they're enthralled by beauty. For these writers writing about those characters, the essential thing in art is not beauty, but imagination and empathy. I quoted before a British musical comedian, performer, whose name is escaping me now, but I'll find it for you, quoted so often by W.H. Auden that Auden was credited with the quotation, who said, "God placed us here to help other people. But what the other people are here for, God only knows. And what he meant about that, why it's funny and wise at the same time, what is really meant by witty, a kind of humor that reflects some intelligence, is there is a kind of charity of our wanting to help other people that has nothing to do with recognizing their reality. I have a lot of money. I don't, but let's imagine I do. And I feel good when I give my money away. So I give my money away to all of you, not because I really care or know all of you, because it's better for me. I love teaching literature. And so if I can get people in a room, Zoom-wise or otherwise, and they'll listen to me talk about literature, good for me. But if the person giving out the money doesn't care about the people getting the money, doesn't have any sense of their reality, if my teaching is about what I say and not what you learn, it's as selfish as a person who never gives away a dime or never instructs anybody about anything. The key to this being broad is knowing what other people are like. When the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, it's no good if you make fun of other people because you don't care if other people make fun of you. The golden rule said that's permitted. You have a thick skin, you make lots of jokes at your own expense and other people's expense. If you like telling jokes that other people find hurtful, and your defense is, well, it wouldn't hurt me, so I'm doing unto you, just as I wouldn't mind being done unto me, that doesn't cut it. The unspoken corollary of the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you if you were them. If you understood how they really are, you would know that you shouldn't say this to that person. You shouldn't do this. And so a requirement of the golden rule is not just what you do, but how you know other people. And that's that joke about what other people are here for. I don't know. You're supposed to know. You're supposed to find out what other people are here for. That's Margaret's message. And it's a strong enough message that she can tolerate the gulf between her and Henry. That's the message of Mrs. Dalloway, to plunge into life as if she were diving into the ocean. And life is not just the June air of that London morning, it's other people. It's other people.
Great. Got a couple more comments. From Patricia again. I loved reading Howard's End, but I thought The Secret Agent was heavy lifting. It was just dreary. The movie Hitchcock made, Sabotage, was a lot more fun than the novel. Usually movies made of books are poor replicas. This was just more appealing. Lightening things up a bit proved a plus in that case, don't you think?
Yeah, well, we have to give credit that it's Hitchcock, first of all. And I want to say that A Secret Agent, the novel, yes, is dreary. Conrad intended it to be dreary. It's not only about an anarchist plot, but it's an anarchist plot by people who are ineffectual. And no good comes of that novel. In fact, I learned as a young teacher, I used to teach a seminar course for first-year students called Crime and Punishment. I was smart enough not to include Crime and Punishment as too big and heavy a book for first-year students. But we did Macbeth, and we did a detective novel, and we did Sherlock Holmes, and we did The Scarlet Letter, and we did The Secret Agent. And we were talking about the notion in life and culture, literature, of things going wrong, of crimes, and how they might be atoned for, or resolved, or paid for, or transcended. And I found, teaching that course twice, that I've done this ever since, I always ask students to rank the books we read by the ones they enjoyed the most, and then down to the ones they enjoyed the least, and they could have as many ties as possible. And usually there's a real variety. And every time I taught that course, this is to Patricia's credit, A Secret Agent was at the very bottom. None of my undergraduates liked reading A Secret Agent. Very few of them wrote papers on it. And it's because its nihilism is too dark for 18-year-olds. And I say that with complete respect for 18-year-olds who shouldn't know anything about nihilism. And so I took it off of the syllabus, even though it's a novel I have great admiration and affection for. It is a very dark novel, and part of what makes it dark is its irony is not resolved. And I'll say this, and I know that I'm lecturing broadly now, but this is part of the notion of this series about getting up the culture. At the heart of irony is that there is an apparent conflict between two things that either shouldn't both be true or seem to contradict each other. And so the easiest way to give an example would be sarcasm. I see Michael and I say to him, thanks very much for sending me the birthday card. I really appreciate it. So that's fact number one. I'm thanking him. Michael knows that he didn't send me a birthday card. And that's fact number two. We both know he didn't. Why would I say such a thing? Well, the irony is resolved because I'm being sarcastic. I'm either trying to suggest that my feelings are hurt or I'm trying to hurt his feelings, but you're not going to sit for hours and try to puzzle through. He thanked me for a card that I never sent. What can that possibly mean? In that very straightforward sense of irony, it gets resolved, and the resolution teaches you something about me, my relationship to Michael, and so on. So in Oedipus Rex, if Oedipus swears he will track down the killer who's done this deed and make sure that person is exiled, there are people, including his wife/mother, which is the whole problem, who knows that it's him, who keeps saying, don't be such a hero trying to figure this out. Let it go. And she's the one who knows. And he's heroic and he won't let it go. And because he won't let it go, he becomes the tragic victim of his own investigation. And so the Greek notion that be careful what you wish for is left to make us think, oh my Lord, even someone as powerful, as insistent in his heroism, solves the riddle of the Sphinx, saves the city from plague, comes in, becomes the new king, is going to solve the murder of the previous king. It turns out he's met the enemy and it's him. What's the resolution of that irony? The gods work in mysterious ways. Next time someone tells you, don't try to beat your fate, don't. In The Secret Agent, the idea that these petty men are involved in something for venal purposes. Nobody except the professor is high-minded, and his high-mindedness is purely technique. He wants to create a perfect bomb. There's no principle, there's no idea. Forget about breath, forget about connecting to other people. And it's not in Inspector Heat or the commissioner or Ethelred. All of the men involved in the power structure are involved in their own self-interest. The women, Winnie and her mother, are involved in their own self-interest. It's centered around Stevie, but you don't get credit as a mother or sister for being interested in your own flesh and blood. Nobody has anything that could be called an ideal. So at the end of the novel, when Winnie Verloc first killed by Winnie and Winnie erasing herself, when these characters are erased, when Ossipon, who is going to try to exploit Winnie for sex and money, he's thwarted, he just goes on. And the professor goes on, as I said, like a pest. Nobody says, you know what? I see what this means. I see what we have to do better. In Howard's End, there is a generic sense that we will do better in combining these three different families. In Mrs. Dalloway, and let me use my remaining minute or so to say this, it is understanding what and who Mrs. Dalloway is. And the last line of that novel is her former lover, who she has no actual sexual interest in at this moment, says that he feels this excitement, this feeling that he can't describe, and says, because it was Clarissa, for there she was. That Clarissa Mrs. Dalloway, is apprehended at the end of the novel by somebody who knows her. To use the language I've been using this evening, he's connected to her, not sexually, not even socially, in that the next day they promise they're going to go out for lunch. He apprehends her as a kind of act of imagination. And before he's done that, before Peter makes that connection at the party, Mrs. Dalloway, who stepped out of the party as host to bemoan the fact that the doctor has come to say that he had a patient who committed suicide. This is Septimus, the war-shocked World War I veteran, by throwing himself out a window, and that he took a very different kind of plunge into reality than Mrs. Dalloway was thinking about herself. She's upset that he's come into her party like a wine stain on a white carpet. And she spends pages up in a room thinking about what that means and what he did and the reality of this man she's never met. And she changes her attitude towards many, many things. And she comes back down to the party having connected to someone who is never in her life directly, who first comes into her life as a bad report at a party that she wishes hadn't been made by the doctor who treated him. And now she has a better understanding. And that's a resolution of many of the tensions and ironies in that novel. For Clarissa, there she was. Those of you who have great loves in your life of any kind, family or friends, I think it's especially true of people who have children and grandchildren. My youngest daughter is getting married tomorrow evening in Mystic, Connecticut. You know that all you have to do is apprehend your children, your partner, your parents, whoever it is who's the object of your true love, that seeing there they are, just look at that face, just look, here they are, is a great joy. That's the connection that Mrs. Dalloway makes, viscerally and individually. E.M. Foster's a different writer. He's making it symbolically and broadly. And I'll end there, if that's okay.
Great, thanks, Mark. So there were a couple of other short comments, but and you can either bring them up next week. One of them is sort of broad in the sense it might apply to other things. And also, as we said, Mark's always happy to get emails from people. If you don't have his email address, just let me know and I'll forward it to you. And otherwise, thanks, Mark. We'll see you again next Thursday.
Right. And let me say to those of you who are going to read Mrs. Dalloway or reread it and be here next time, who didn't hear me preview it slightly last time, people who knew of Virginia Woolf but didn't know her thought that when she wrote this novel about a woman, upper middle class, who was worried about her party coming off well and how the flowers would be bought, thought that Virginia Woolf, this artistic intellectual, was mocking Clarissa as a kind of home buddy, society matron, and that she was kind of a comic figure. And what they didn't appreciate was this notion of connecting. And Virginia Woolf felt in the world between the wars, the fragmented world between the wars. Look at Picasso's great painting of Guernica, that collage, that the best thing an artist could do was to connect people to each other and to themselves. And one of the ways to do that is to throw a party. And in her notebooks, Virginia used the image of a host to talk about what an artist can do, that an artist, for the hours that you're within the covers of her novel, is hosting you to an event that's going to connect you to something outside yourself. That's not what Dickens thought. That's not even what George Eliot or Henry James thought. That's new. I'll see you next time. Stay well.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for attending, and we'll see you all next week. We should have a link to the recording in a day or two. And the first one was there already on our YouTube channel. And again, thanks. We'll see you next Thursday.
Bye.